Sorry, what country do we live in? At what point does a judge turn to the person who's about to be sentenced and be like, so what do you think you should get? I don't know, I'm debating if you should go to jail or not, but what do you think? What seems like a harsh punishment for you? What seems hard for you? Well, I think it's pretty bad. I feel like I'm punished enough. Why don't we just work on you using your name in a better way? Okay, son? Tell your mama to go pay $100 to the court. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is True Denise, and we're going to keep going in Astronaut, and this should be our last week on this book. We have 3 more women to talk about, so not very many left. 2 of the women we're going to talk about, one in today's episode, the other in the next episode I do, are 2 women who were not married into the Kennedy clan, were not associated with the Kennedys any more than they were friends with the Kennedy children. First one we're going to discuss is Pamela Kelly, and a terrible accident that happened to her when she was with some of the Kennedy children, and the chaos that always swirled around those kids who really had no upbringing whatsoever. It seems like their parents were just out to lunch 100% of the time. And so the kids, not surprisingly, were pretty wild and did a lot of wild things. And in the process of being wild, woolly, and, having no responsibilities whatsoever, end up being careless and hurting people really badly. So we talk about her. And then the next episode that we do is about a bit more controversial character. Her name is Martha Moxley, and there's a lot of controversy swirling about what happened to her. She died a very tragic and mysterious death, and it's been associated with the Kennedys for a long time. RFK Jr. wrote a book explaining why this was not a Kennedy problem and why his cousin had nothing to do with it. And Maureen Callahan puts forth a different narrative. But as we'll discuss in our final episode on this book, when we talk about RFK Jr.'s wife, she has real feelings against RFK Jr., which I just don't share. And so it feels like with all the Kennedy men in this book, she just has an axe to grind. And it's why I kept his wife's story to the last, because I just feel like it's an unfair story. And the way she presents the facts are definitely damning. It's not a good look. But I also feel like he's a person who has come out and said that he was very troubled and that he did a lot of stupid things growing up. But I also believe in redemption. And I feel like he's one of the few Kennedys who have come out and said, I didn't treat people very well, and I was deep in my addictions, and I had extreme problems. And for somebody who wants to come out publicly and say those things, seems like, well, why can't we just let people move on? Why do we always have to remind them of their worst days? So I've kept that story for the last one for that reason. But today and tomorrow we'll be talking about people who are just in the Kennedy sphere and who were hurt because of that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. This episode, like I said, is about Pamela Kelly. Summer of 1973, Cape Cod. Pamela Kelly was one of Hyannis's golden girls, popular and cool, with long blonde hair parted down the middle. She and her siblings had grown up close to the Kennedy compound, going to birthday parties and movie nights at the Robert F. Kennedy house, friends with most of the children. The Kennedy compound by now was a storied place in American mythology, but it really wasn't a compound. Rose and Joe Kennedy had a big house on the ocean. That was where they took all those photos of the Kennedys playing touch football or toothy roughhousing. Jackie and JFK had a smaller house around the corner, and other family members wound up buying houses nearby. Summer were the only time that Bobby Kennedy Jr. and his brothers Joe and David were around. All 3 boys were especially drawn to Pam. Bobby and Joe were hellions, but David was the sensitive one, and that made him weak in the eyes of the other Kennedys. But Pam and her sisters adored David. He was so kind, so genuinely interested in other people. Now, before I go on, I just want to make sure that you have kept abreast of what part of the family we're in right now. So obviously there's the matriarch, there's Joe and Rose. Joe and Rose has a whole passel of kids, one of whom was Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy then had a son named Bobby after him, Bobby Jr. The Bobby that we're talking about in this story is the son, the RFK Jr. who we now see in politics. Okay, anyway, this would be Pam's last summer on the Cape before graduating high school, and she had begun seeing David. Ethel Kennedy didn't like the Kelly girls. But then Ethel didn't seem to like many people, including sometimes her own children. Maybe because Pam was so much like Ethel's boys. Wild and impetuous, school not a priority, drinking and taking drugs no real aim in life. Not yet, at least. But to Ethel, girls were the problem. It didn't matter that her boys were known as the Hyannis Port Terrors, that they painted their faces black before slipping out into the night to stuff their neighbors' tailpipes with potatoes, or that they would run into oncoming traffic and fall on the road, pretending to be mortally wounded, while their cousins terrorized those random drivers. "You killed a Kennedy!" they would yell. Bobby Jr., as the ringleader, would roam the streets with one of his massive hawks. These birds were a point of pride for him, having taken up falconry after his father's assassination. Everyone else hated those hawks, because Bobby never really learned how to train them, yet he insisted on having his birds and other exotic animals in his room at boarding school. He once threatened Diana's police officer with one of his hawks, saying he had trained it to kill cops. Everything Ethel's kids did on the Cape was to prove a single point. Kennedys could get away with anything. August 13th on the Cape was gusty and raw and no good for the beach. David and Joe and a bunch of other kids were headed to Nantucket on the ferry. Would Pam and her younger sister Kim like to come? Pam wasn't feeling all that great, but Kim wanted to go, with her sister. Kim was near tears, begging Pam to change her mind. Part of it, Pam knew, was that Kim was trying to cram in as much time together before Pam graduated and head off to her new life that she planned in San Francisco. Pam and Kim were only 1 year apart, Irish twins they were called, and especially close. How could Pam say no? So they packed their bags, and the next day was as Pam expected. She and Kim, among 7 kids, piled into a jeep with seating for only 4. There was no roof. Joe was at the wheel, tearing through the unpaved roads of Nantucket, kids just spilling out of the jeep, playing the usual Kennedy game of ducking under low-hanging tree branches as they sped along, a dare that could get you clotheslined by a branch or worse. Joints were passed. Joe drove in circles before crossing into other lanes and into oncoming traffic. He swerved. The jeep flipped at least twice. Its passengers launched into the air like small missiles. Kim landed on the pavement. Another girl thudded down on top of her. 3 others were thrown into the woods. "Where's Pam?" Kim was frantic. "Where's Pam? Where's Pam?" Passers-by halted. Ambulances came with what small mercies they could offer on such a tiny island, loading Kim and Pam and a girl named Mary into the first ambulance on stretchers. "Pam," Kim said, "how are you?" "I can't feel my legs," Pam said. Mary was screaming her head off. "I can't feel anything," Pam said. "You're in shock, Pam," Kim said. "You'll be all right." All right, so pretty grim picture we have here, right? Kennedy kids just, acting wild. And the thing is that as much as I think Maureen Callahan embellishes things, I have a feeling that she's telling the truth about this. And why shouldn't she be telling the truth about this? If you were a Kennedy child and you'd been told your whole life that pretty much anything goes, and no parent really had ever bothered to step in and stop you and never so much as said no, why wouldn't you think that the whole world belonged to you? Didn't it? I mean, it did. Honestly, if you were a Kennedy, the whole world did belong to you. And what was anybody going to say to you? You could do anything you wanted. When you're in your teenage years, you're just so reckless anyway. But then somebody gives you a ticket and says, you're not going to get in trouble. Why wouldn't you push the boundaries? Why wouldn't you see if there was anything you could get in trouble for? Just out of curiosity. Pam had been thrown 30 feet before smashing down onto a tree stump. A priest was called to give her last rites. Then she was carried by stretcher into a helicopter. 3 hours later, Pam was back on the mainland at the Cape Cod Hospital in Hyannis, rushed into emergency surgery with a swollen spine. When her surgeons emerged 7 hours later, surgeons called in by Ted Kennedy from Boston among the best there were, they told the Kellys that it would be 2 weeks before they would know if Pam would ever walk again. Her older sister Karen was in the tiny Cape Cod waiting room. She'd been working her summer job at the CVS pharmacy at the mall when her parents called her manager asking for Karen to please be sent home. Kim had been checked out of the emergency room hours earlier and was back home in their living room. The sisters sat in silence for a few minutes as they watched a news report about the accident. Kim threw a book at the TV and broke it. That night, Karen went to the hospital. It seemed like all the Kennedys were there, including others who hadn't been on Nantucket but were summering on the Cape. Joe's cousin, Maria Shriver, among them. The Kelly kids loved Maria, thought she was a doll. Kim, choking back tears, went outside to smoke a cigarette. Maria followed and did her best to comfort her, as Kennedys knew how. "Don't cry," she told Karen. "Don't cry in front of all these people." Maria herself was maybe 18 years old, but at least she was trying to help, unlike Joe, who was also at the hospital instead of where he should be, in a police interrogation room. He hadn't been tested for drugs or alcohol after the crash. He hadn't said, "I'm sorry," to the Kellys or to anyone. Kim would blame herself. "I'm the one who should be hurt," she would say. "I'm stronger than she is." Why Pam, sweet, gentle, funny Pam, who loved animals, who would take the blame for any of her siblings any time, because her parents knew she would never really be the guilty one anyway. Pam, who didn't ask for much in life, who was the happiest sitting under a streetlight on summer nights after family dinners or stargazing on the beach, breathing in the soft, salty ocean air with her friends. Kim, of course, and Bobby Jr. and Joe and David, promising each other that no matter where life took them, they would always reunite here. On those evenings, when it was time to go home, Pam and Kim would break off and stay at the beach, gulls smashing shells against craggy rocks, and just sit. The vastness of the ocean against the night sky seemed to embody their future. Huge, unknowable, vaguely mystical, touched by this storied American family who shared their largesse along with their danger. The carnage as reported was unbelievable. Mary's pelvis and femur were shattered. 2 girls had broken their necks. 6 days later, Joe Kennedy was in court, standing before Judge George Anastas, a college roommate of his late Uncle Joseph Kennedy, who had been killed in the war. There Joe sat, inexpressive and emotionless, as witness and drivers testified that Joe had been driving in the wrong lane and speeding while kids were standing up and hanging out of the Jeep. Joe pled not guilty, even though he had told the police that the accident was all his fault. How could you plead not guilty? Like, how is that even a feasible plea? You were the driver, were you not? So you are guilty. You got too many people in the car. You're speeding. You're going through the wrong lanes of traffic. You're spinning circles in the middle of the road, but you're not at fault? Like, why would his lawyer even let him say that? Not guilty. Well, what are you then? Like, how would you, I would like to know how you would define your participation in this catastrophe. His mother, Ethel, was in the small Nantucket courthouse, as was his Uncle Ted. The judge turned to Joe. Do you believe that prison sentences deter automobile accidents? The judge asked. I don't think so, Joe said. I think that someone getting seriously hurt would be more of a deterrent. 4 of his 7 passengers had been gravely injured. You had a great father, and you have a great mother, Anastas said. Use your illustrious name as an asset instead of coming into court like this. He gave Joe a $100 fine and let him go. Sorry. What country do we live in? At what point does a judge turn to the person who's about to be sentenced and be like, so what do you think you should get? I don't know. I'm debating if you should go to jail or not, but what do you think? What seems like a harsh punishment for you? What seems hard for you? Well, I think it's pretty bad. I mean, I feel like I'm punished enough. I agree. Well, why don't we just work on you using your name in a better way? Okay, son, tell your mama to go pay $100 to the court. And $100, that wouldn't even make a ding in the Kennedy finances. $100, that's not even a pain. I mean, it's like of all the things. Okay, so he got out of jail. Like, he didn't have to go to prison for this. All kinds of people maimed, hurt, injured. No punishment whatsoever. And all they can manage to scrape together as an idea was, what about a $100 fee? That seems good. Seems good. Y'all good with that? Y'all good with that? Okay. The worst. What is wrong with people? It was quick and tidy, both in court and the press. In their coverage of Joe's court hearings, the New York Times didn't mention Pam's name or the extent of her injuries until the last paragraph. Again, truly, what trance was America under for so many years? How does it behoove us as a nation to take such gentle care of these wild people? What point and purpose was there to safeguarding the Kennedy name to such extreme degrees that this young hellion could get in a car, whirl it around, people are literally flying out of the Jeep? And your response to him in court is, well, what do you think you should get? Okay. Well, how about $100 then? You give us $100, we'll call it even. I don't understand. I don't understand why we would function that way. I don't understand the motivation of protecting them. Were we just so desperate for the story of Camelot that we were just willing to put blinders on our eyes? And why are we so obsessed with a myth? What is the point of the myth? Why do I need to believe that? Like, what is behind the myth? That we are a great and mighty country and that we could produce this kind of individual? Like, is that what it is? I don't know. The thing is that there's just so many legitimately wonderful, great Americans that I don't understand why we are having to prop up people who are frauds when we could just cast our eyes out into the world and find so many different Americans who are worthy of the praise that the Kennedys received. Okay, well, her mother delivered the news. She told Pam she would never walk again, that the doctor said she would never have children, and that she probably wouldn't live past the age of 40. It's so damning to hear that. She's so young. She's 18 years old. You're never going to walk again. You're never going to have kids. And, you'll be lucky if you live past 40. Pam didn't say a word. Tears spilled down her face. 2 weeks earlier, her whole life lay ahead of her. And now she was in a hospital bed, shivering under ice packs meant to relieve her back spasms. She would never go to the bathroom normally again. Her world would be wheelchairs and physical therapy and catheters. And Kennedys, they kept coming into her room. Caroline and Maria and Joe bringing flowers and freshly baked cookies and a movie projector, while the older Kennedys, Rose and Ethel and Ted, were talking to Pam's parents about a settlement. No need to involve lawyers or civil lawsuits in the media, they said. Pam's parents wanted to sue, but Pam wouldn't hear of it. David was her boyfriend, Joe was her friend, and you just don't, Pam said. You don't sue your friends. Her parents tried to explain. Pam's condition was going to require a lot more than she would understand. To begin with, their house would have to be retrofitted for her wheelchair. Steps turned into ramps, doorways, and at least one shower made wide enough for her wheelchair. She would need a new bed with a bar over it so that she could lift herself up in the middle of the night if she had to go to the bathroom, or mornings when no one was home. She would need help cleaning and dressing herself, cooking and going to the bathroom, probably for the rest of her life. She would require constant physical therapy so that her legs wouldn't atrophy. If they sued, her parents explained, Joe would not pay a dime. His insurance company would cover it. Pam still wouldn't do it. Besides, she said, Joe had promised whatever Pam needed, whenever she needed it, he would take care of her, always. Well, a Kennedy promise is as good as water in a leaky bucket. I mean, poor Pam, she didn't realize that. She doesn't know all we know, but my goodness gracious. And what is this young teenage Joe? He doesn't even know what he's saying when he says that. You know, it's the promise that you would make to somebody who's lying there paralyzed because of your driving. Of course, you would tell them, I'll do anything you need at any time, whenever. But of course, as soon as he's able to forget about this, he's going to hurry up and forget about it because who wants to feel this pain? Who wants to know that you paralyzed someone? He's not going to continually dip his life into the bucket of her pain by going and saying, okay, well, what do you need now? How can I help you now? He's not selfless enough for that. What Pam didn't know was how troubled Joe was, as troubled as Bobby. Joe had entree to all the best schools, but was academically lazy. He wanted special treatment, and when he got it, he resented it. After the accident, a Kennedy family friend had connected Joe with Diane Clemens, a Berkeley professor who had worked on his Uncle Jack's presidential campaign. Out of affection for his uncle, Diane invited Joe to live in her basement apartment while he went to college on the West Coast, and waited for the publicity surrounding the crash to blow over. And so it was that Clemens came home one night to find that Joe had scared her 11-year-old daughter, breaking down a locked door and chasing the girl through the house. "I'll kill you!" he screamed. Not long after that, Joe had 2 major car accidents, flipping his Toyota pickup into a ravine and crashing into a car driven by a 16-year-old. Do all of these Kennedys have like a secret underlying death wish? Because this seems extreme. That you would treat somebody's home like, your own personal nightmare, but then that you would get in a car after you've already had like a major car accident, and now 2 times after that, you're getting into cars and driving so recklessly that you're flipping them down into ravines and crashing into other people's cars. Just seems shocking. It seems shocking that you wouldn't be more careful or that you would even be able to drive again. I mean, I feel like I would be paralyzed with fear to ever get behind the wheel of a car. David had been in the same hospital as Pam the whole time, in traction with a broken back. He didn't believe it when one of Pam's friends told him that she would be paralyzed for life. He insisted on getting wheeled into Pam's room. "That effing bitch friend of yours," he said to Pam. "You wouldn't believe the shit she's been telling me." "It's true," Pam said. It was her first inkling that the Kennedys would try to minimize her agony, to make her go away. Pam spent 3 months in Cape Cod Hospital and another 9 months in rehab at Mass General. Her mother quit her job to tend to Pam full-time. In the end, neither Pam nor the Kellys sued Joe. They settled instead with the company that had insured the Jeep and used the $668,000 to buy a large Hyannisport house with a swimming pool and a tennis court. It overlooked a big pond and was a permanent reminder of all the things that Pam could no longer do. Okay. Are we supposed to believe, from this reporting by Callahan, and I'm not saying that it's not true, but this is shocking, that the parents were desperate to sue the Kennedys for her care. And then when they did receive an insurance payout from the company who had insured the Jeep, they used that money, $668,000, to buy a huge house with a swimming pool and a tennis court. Was that money not supposed to go to Pam's care? What's Pam going to do in the swimming pool? I mean, I suppose you could, lower her in and give her something to hold on to so she doesn't drown. What's she going to do with the tennis court? Is she going to go walk around that pond out back? I mean, it's like, what's going on with the choice there? In public, Pam was all cheer and a brave face. She made it a point to travel with Kim, to learn to dance by tipping back her wheelchair, to happily greet strangers and tourists who recognized her as the girl from the Kennedy accident. Her pride allowed for nothing else. In private, Pam was shattered. She had to use a catheter to urinate. She had to take suppositories to have bowel movements. Her mother had to roll her over to prevent bed sores. Pam dreaded falling and had to learn how to pick herself up, more than half her body now dead weight. In those first 2 years, Pam would hole up in her room and throw things. At the wall, at her siblings. She cried night after night, loudly enough for the whole family to hear. She would yell at her mother to make everything all right. She took a lit cigarette and branded her stomach with 3 letters, D-I-E. And she'd say it out loud, I want to die. Meanwhile, David, already a drug user, slid deeper into his addiction. After Pam, his next big relationship was with the starlet Rachel Ward, who did not recognize the marks on David's arms for what they were, tracks from shooting heroin 5 times a day. In and out of rehab, hospitalized twice for endocarditis, David saw himself as the worst thing a Kennedy could be. Weak. A political liability. By 1980, 2 years after Pam's accident, David had broken up with Ward and had moved to Sacramento, though he rarely ventured outside. He watched television 24/7 amid drug-induced hallucinations. He came upon a photo of his Aunt Rosemary in a magazine, as she was now, and David was stricken. If his grandfather had still been alive, what would have stopped him from doing something similar to David? Was he not as much of an embarrassment? A failure? Desperate, he called Pam. He begged her to come stay with him for a little while. Pam agreed. He told her that she would need to leave her wheelchair at home. In David's defense, he is on drugs. I can't leave my wheelchair here, David, Pam said. It's part of me, and I'm part of it. That was the end for Pam. The Kennedys were now nothing to her, just as she was to them. The same stubbornness that had kept Pam from suing Joe was now the very thing that kept her going. She got married, and in 1989 she had a baby, protesting in a crosswalk that this was non-negotiable for anyone in a wheelchair. Cord gave Pam a sense of purpose that she'd never had before, but it didn't pay her bills. It didn't help her as her medical needs grew, as she battled reoccurring back spasms and bladder cancer. It didn't pay for childcare or visiting nurses or a housekeeper. Pam turned to Joe for help several times during such hardships, but each time she was rebuffed. I'm not made of money, he'd tell her. In the decades since the accident, Joe married, had twin boys, and moved to a gorgeous 1860s farmhouse. He had founded a nonprofit called Citizens Energy Corps in 1979 and turned it into something of a personal piggy bank, eventually paying himself a 6-figure salary. But I'm not made out of money. Don't roll that wheelchair up to my door and come knocking. I'm not interested in helping you. It'll only cause your injuries, but can't spare a penny here. In 1986, Joe ran for Congress as, he claimed, the candidate of ordinary, hardworking families. Pam would sometimes be mentioned in articles about Joe, usually not by name. He would call her from time to time and invite her to be his special guest at campaign stops. Neither before his election to Congress nor during his subsequent 5 terms did Joe ever sit down with Pam or her siblings or parents to talk about the accident or to apologize or to say what he might do for Pam and people like her. Joe doesn't give a shit about me, Pam would say. He doesn't care. Well, that's true. And I'm sad that she finally had to come to the realization. I wish she'd realized that when she was younger and could have sued Joe, not out of spite, but just to make sure that she was taken care of in her declining years. Her sister Karen knew. Pam was right. Karen had been at a fundraiser for Joe's sister Kathleen, who was running for governor of Maryland, when Joe came in and started working the room, shaking hands and self-deprecatingly introducing himself. Hi, Joe Kennedy. Joe, hi. He got to Karen and he gave her the same greeting. I know who you are, she said. Joe took a beat. Oh, Karen, he said. She remembered nothing else except for what he didn't ask. How's Pam? Well, to be fair, if you had crippled somebody and you saw her sister at a campaign fundraiser for your sister who's running for governor, it would be delicate to ask about that. Of course, a decent human being would have done it, would have at least tried to do it, would have at least tried to bring up the most excruciating moment of your life. But I also think that as much as I want to point a finger and be like, well, that wasn't very decent of him, I think any of us would have found it awkward if you saw the sister of the girl who you had terribly hurt, and it would be hard to ask about Pam. It would be. I think I would be. I think I would be really embarrassed and ashamed every time I saw Pam or anybody from her family. It was a regret for the Kellys not having sued Joe Kennedy, or at least not getting an agreement in writing. But yeah, the word of a young teenager that he's going to take care of his maimed friend is hardly anything to live by. Of course, that's what he would have said in the face of seeing your your dear friend laid out, and she just had this surgery, and she's not going to walk, and she can't supposedly have kids, and at that time you thought she wasn't going to live past 40. It's like, you would have said anything you needed to say to quell your conscience. And for everybody in the family, including the parents, to be like, well, Joe said he'd help. I mean, it's the word of a wild, reckless teenager. He's going to say anything right now to feel better. So yeah, they should have gotten it in writing. Over 47 years, Joe, who by 2005 had amassed a real estate portfolio worth $2 million, had given Pam $50,000 in total. If you don't mind me just jumping in real quick, if he is buying real estate in Hyannis, a real estate portfolio worth $2 million is actually not that much. It isn't. And I think that it's disingenuous of this author to be like, $2 million. Well, yeah, that's a big number. A $2 million house in Hyannisport is not the same thing as, say, a $2 million house in Birmingham, Alabama. Don't just throw around big sounding numbers. Consider where his house is, Maureen Callahan. Don't be trying to make points. It's not honest journalism. A real estate portfolio of $2 million in Hyannisport? Okay. It's just trying to make him sound worse than he is. I think that's what my point is. Anyway, she constantly debated whether to go to the press. Her anonymity outside of Hyannis was a blessing and a curse. In every recap of so-called Kennedy tragedies, if Pam was mentioned at all, it was never by name. She was just the girl, one in a long litany. And Pam had been a good girl at that. She never complained. She'd never tried to hold a grudge against the Kennedys. What happens to me stinks, she once said, but I made something good out of it. She felt that Joe's father, Robert, whom she admired, and his uncle Jack would have been proud of what she'd done for the disabled. It was, after all, his own sister Rosemary who inspired JFK to make advocacy for the physically and mentally disabled part of his administration's agenda. Why couldn't Joe see that? Well, because Joe's the one who did it to you, right? So it's not like you're just this friend of his who happened to be in a wheelchair. You're in a wheelchair because of what he did, and I think that Joe's way of coping with it was to just try to push it away from himself. By 2005, Pam was in terrible shape. Sickly and emaciated, she needed a new bed and a new wheelchair. She could no longer drive and was forced to retire from Cord. She was losing her ability to care for herself and required more help than her family could provide. I want to stay in my house and I want to be able to leave something to my daughter, Pam said. When I got hurt in 1973, I really believed that Joe would do the right thing. That's what I said to my dad. You don't have to sue them. They'll do the right thing. But they haven't done the right thing yet, and I'm tired of it. Her experience in 1999 during the days-long search for JFK Jr.'s plane, reporters on the Cape right in front of her and not knowing who she was, disturbed her greatly. She had no problem going public now. She had no problem offering her unfiltered thoughts about Joe Kennedy. I feel like he thinks I'm a piece of trash sitting in a wheelchair, she told a local reporter. It worked. Joe, who had recently left Congress to return to the energy company that he had founded before entering politics, was shamed into giving Pam help, a little over $2,000 a month. It wasn't nearly enough. In 2019, facing bankruptcy and the loss of her home, she spoke to People magazine. I don't think anybody still wonders where I am today, Pam said. I don't think anybody remembers, really. Pam Kelly Berkeley died on November 20th, 2020, at the age of 65, of sepsis. The family heard nothing from Joe. The very next month, his checks to Pam stopped. So he did know that she had died, but he couldn't bestir himself to send any condolences whatsoever. After the accident, Pam's sister Kim wrote an essay about her sister. It was just for herself and her siblings, no one else. She called it Wings, a nod to Pam's free spirit and her tenderness. This young girl who sought out injured birds and nursed them until they could fly. A girl whose body began breaking down before its time. A girl who grew into a woman whose lifelong love of sea gave her solace to a point. Kim wrote of taking Pam to the beach after the accident. I took my sister back to the big breakwater, Kim said. I carried her up, through and over the wet rocks. We sat under the tower with the red and green blinking lights, and we could hear the gong buoy in the distance. We remembered, and I wiped the tears from her eyes. I turned my head toward the west so she wouldn't see mine. I held her tightly and walked her back to where we had played mermaids. We picked the wild roses, and they smelled as beautiful as ever. We put a few in our hair, which was no longer golden blonde. Some we threw into the ocean, letting the tide take them, the petals floating away with many of our dreams. When I found red and blue-green sea glass, I think of her. They are the most valuable possessions of all mermaids. Her legs no longer work, but underwater she glides swiftly with stamina, grace, and dignity, and outdoes any fish in the ocean. Kim ended it with a wish that she could be as strong and self-reliant as Pam. She didn't know if she ever would get there. I'm still looking, she wrote, for a couple pairs of wings. That's the end of the story about Pamela Kelly. And I hate that tragedy. And it was just born out of complete youthful foolishness that would lead her to have been in such a terrible accident. Joe acted terribly, terribly. But I also think that to include Pam's story in this book about how treacherous the Kennedy men are is, I feel like, a little bit unfair. Now, I do think that Joe acted really, really callous later in life towards Pam. I think that his shame, I think because he had never dealt with it properly, he'd never paid what dues he could to her, he always had to be ashamed of what had happened. I think if he had genuinely looked to carve out some help for her throughout her life, he could have forgiven himself for the accident. But as long as you keep pushing the person away whose disabilities are your fault, you're never going to be able to get past what you did. You're never going to be able to forgive yourself because you aren't doing right by that person now. Joe was acting ridiculous in that car with all those people and, riding through the streets and everything. It was super careless of him, ridiculously careless. All the kids who were in that car who were willing to put their lives under Joe's driving skills were also being careless because they knew what kind of driver he was. And it would just seem like nothing bad was going to happen. They seemed to have no self-preservation whatsoever. But it was an accident. Joe didn't do that on purpose to fling everybody out of the car. Although, I suppose a person could argue and say, well, didn't he do it on purpose because he was driving so recklessly? But I am more than certain that he did not get in the car that day and think, I hope I can throw this girl out of the car so she hits her spine on a stump. So I'm struggling with this chapter because I feel like the author is trying to act as though Joe's youthful carelessness is the story here. I think the story here is the fact that people like the judge didn't make him pay for it. I think the story here is that other people in the family didn't step up and say, hey, Joe, we need to figure out a written agreement on what we owe the Kellys. We've got to take care of Pam. The story is not necessarily about Joe, but all the workings around Joe that allowed him to be who he was. The story here is the fact that Ethel Kennedy had no control over her kids, and that her kids, Joe, David, and Bobby Jr., when he was younger, were wild. And that David's over here nobody seems to know or care what's going on with David while he watches TV 24/7 holed up in his house in Sacramento. This thesis of this book is growing stale to me, is what I'm trying to say to you. And I'm just getting a little bit sick and tired of the compiling of a bunch of negative facts and acting as though that is the story. There's just so much more to it. Now, again, Pam lived a really, really hard life because of Joe's carelessness. I'm not giving Joe a pass on his carelessness, and I definitely think that later in life, he really abandoned his responsibilities to somebody who he had called a friend, and that makes it even more hurtful. It's not like this was a stranger that he didn't know. This was one of his dear childhood friends, and then for him later in life to just use her when he needed somebody at a campaign stop, when he needed her presence there so that the whole world would think that he had been fair and good to the girl he had maimed. That's wrong. It was a lie. It was a living lie. So I give no protection to him for how he behaved later in life as an adult. But I just think that I just think the inclusion of this chapter really pushes the limits of what Maureen Callahan is trying to say in this book. I think that there are certainly women in the book who should have been included, but at this point it feels like she's scraping the bottom of the barrel to be like, and Pam Kelly. It's like, oh, okay, all right. I get it. They're all the worst. They had no redeeming factors. But I just think that looking into all of our own souls personally, we can all look at ourselves, and if we were to cherry pick all the worst moments of our lives and a book was to be written about that, we would all come out looking like the devil himself, so I just think that I'm getting a little weary, and I'm glad there's really only 2 more stories to tell. I'm ready to move on. All right. I'll see you guys later. Thanks so much for watching, and tell me what you thought in the comments. Bye.